specific policy proposals, but generally speaking, do you think income tax rates in general in the state are too high?
Well, I mean, I think almost anybody that pays taxes would say taxes are too high. I mean, when we pay our bills, we would always like to pay less. So I'm never going to come out and say, well, the problem is our taxes aren't high enough. I mean, I have dealt, again, Governor Kasich and I have different experiences in terms of how we've balanced budgets before. I was in municipal government for 12 years. By the time this election season is over, I will have submitted all my budgets. We're on a 2-year budget cycle at the county. Again, over $1 billion budgets. Actually, that's on a yearly basis, so we're talking about closer to $3 billion in terms of $2 billion 2-year cycle. I have never balanced a budget by saying, well, what taxes can we increase? Again, and this is one of these things where when you're, especially a campaign of this magnitude, and I've already noticed it's much more ideological and you end up getting put into kind of stereotypical boxes. When I was the mayor of Lakewood, we ended up cutting the total payroll in Lakewood by over 20% in order to balance the budget. Those were not popular decisions, either among employee unions or there were controversial decisions, but there were suggestions at the time, well, let's just tax our way out of the situation. And I didn't think that that was the appropriate thing to do. We had the same advice that I rejected when I became county executive. We had a budgetary gap. Just to give you an example of what's happened in county government, a few years ago we were at roughly 6,400 employees. Our current rate is around 4,800 employees. So there are ways to make government more efficient, and we have done that by using technology, by looking at what actual employment levels should be, and by scrutinizing every single aspect of spending. I still don't believe that's happened at the state level the way that it should be. Again, I came out of a background of I've had to do that, coming out of a congressional background whose dysfunction is on full display this week. I don't think that Governor Kasich had a background with that, and I still don't think the state government is as efficient as it should be. The state budget that was passed, the last 2 budgets have both been bigger than the previous budgets. The original budget that they submitted was bigger than Governor Strickland's last budget, and this budget that they passed on June the 30th was the largest budget in the history of the state of Ohio. Many cities and townships and counties will tell you that isn't their reality. They haven't been passing budgets in recent years that are bigger than they've ever passed before. They've made cuts that are much more significant than the state has. So I know that Governor Kasich's talking point is that he has balanced the budget without raising taxes. Every governor has balanced the budget. Every single one. Just like every mayor has to balance a budget, every township trustee has to balance their budget. They're required to do so by law. We don't have the luxury that the federal government does in terms of just incurring debt. This is, I think, the only governor that has balanced the state budget at the expense of local institutions, whether it be local government or local education, to the extent that they have. So to cast that as, well, taxes didn't go up, you'd have to ask the communities that you cover whether or not they've had to raise their taxes as a result of state policy in the last few years, and I think most of them would say that they have had to do so. The number of school levies that have gone up, or local levies, or local income taxes, or local sales tax issues, is enormous. I had a conversation with Governor Kasich. I've really only had one long conversation with him. Looking forward to having some more. I only really had one long conversation with him. It was right after he and I were both elected. We were both elected in November of 2010. He came up to Cleveland. We sat down and had a meeting, and he was talking about what we could expect. And he said, well, I have some good news and bad news for you. The bad news is I'm going to cut your local government funds. But, it's time for local government to get off the gravy train. That showed to me, it was the first warning sign I had about the administration, because to me it showed in ignorance in terms of what local government, whether it's local schools or local cities, townships, county administrations, what they've been dealing with going back to 2005 and 2006 when tax revenue first started drying up. I don't think he realized, I was coming in as a mayor that had already cut my payroll by 20%. So to hear in 2010 that we needed to get off the gravy train, to me was just not reality. It wasn't reality. And then the panacea was supposed to be Senate Bill 5, that we were going to save so much money through Senate Bill 5 that we wouldn't need any help from the state government. Well, I take issue with that in two ways. Number one is it was an overestimation, first of all, whether Senate Bill 5 was going to pass, which it certainly did not. Secondly, the Senate Bill 5 really would have saved that much money because which I don't believe it would have, because the assumption was that local government was not driving a hard bargain with its local public employees, and that wasn't the case in my city. We had gotten the biggest concessions in the history of the city of Lakewood, just like at the county, we have gotten the biggest concessions in the history of the county with our local labor union. So I disagreed with it in that respect. But I also believe that it was just a misunderstanding of where does the local government fund and where do education funds come from in the first place. The attitude of the state in the last couple of years is that they have some proprietary interest almost, that those are state funds, and that if local communities are insisting on their share of those funds, they are somehow, it's almost like they're asking to be on welfare from the state. That shows, again, a real lack of understanding of where those funds came from in the first place. First of all, they're levied locally, so there are funds, number one. Number two is, if you go back into Ohio history, and I try to be a student of history whenever I can, over and over and over again, when state taxes were increased or levied in the first place, there was an explicit promise that they would be shared with local communities. So back in the 30s, when the state sales tax was originally levied, there was an explicit promise that all of those funds would not be kept for the state. By the way, that was as much of an insistence by the Republican Party as it was by the Democratic Party. Because the Republican Party was saying that they didn't want an over-centralized government that sucked up all of our tax money, that they believed in local government and local control because it was closest to the people. And I totally agree with them about that. So the same thing happened in 1971 when the state income tax was passed. There was an explicit promise that it would be shared with local communities so that it wouldn't lead to, kind of this inevitable expansion of state government. And that has been forgotten now. And now, according to the governor, it's the priority should be that the state gets to keep that money and make those decisions. And so when I see what's happened with the state fiscally in the last few years, I think it's been reckless and irresponsible. It's been balanced like every other state budget has been balanced. But I think it's been balanced largely at the expense of state community or at local communities. Now, in terms of taxation, by the way, the other thing that I think is just wrong-headed in my opinion is not only have they forced local communities to raise their taxes, but they've also objectively, just through state taxation, raised taxes on a large number of Ohio residents. The reason I say that is because when Governor Kasich ran in 2010, he promised that he was going to try to eliminate the Ohio income tax, the state income tax. He only told half of the story because he talked a lot about lowering income taxes. He didn't talk about raising other taxes in order to finance that. And I think if he had, he only won by 77,000 votes. I think if he had, we might have had a different outcome actually in the election. Because what's happened is everyone's sales taxes have gone up. And whether or not so in other words, you've had state income taxes have been cut, but it has been shifted. So that state income tax was not financed by economic growth or cutting in government spending, because economic growth has been tepid and state spending has increased. The state income tax cut has been funded by an increase in the sales tax more than anything else. And whether or not that was a good deal for you or a bad deal for you depends on how much income you have. If you make $500,000 a year, it is a good deal for you because you'll get approximately a $6,000 net tax cut. If you make $50,000 a year, you will get according to I think the most accurate study, you will get a $9 tax cut. If you make $30,000 a year, you will get a net tax increase. If you are on a fixed income, you will automatically get a tax increase because you're not getting a tax cut, because you're not being charged income tax on a pension or Social Security. If you are a senior citizen or someone that just turned 65 and you make $31,000 a year, you lost your homestead exemption, which the average benefit for an Ohio resident is $441. That means you got a net tax increase. If you are a property owner and your local community raised their taxes or your local school district raised their taxes, which they probably did, you also did not get a net tax increase unless you're at the very high end of the income scale. So I'm all for lower taxes whenever we can afford it. I am not for shifting the burden onto local communities and to people that are middle class or working class or the poor.